very good evening to you. I'm Lisa Lord, and my special guest is Professor of Sociology, Crime and Social Inequality at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, Professor Corin Bailey. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, too great to be here.
Now, you have quite a big title. Before we get into anything else, let's look at your specific areas of expertise, if you could break them down for us.
So my work is situated in the field of sociology. I determine myself to be a sociologist rather than a criminologist. However, my primary interest is in crime. I would say I do 90% of my work is in crime, and probably 10% looks at purely at poverty-related issues. But as you can imagine, the two do intersect. So basically, I tend to look at what is and work my way back. So for example, maybe I look at the fact that there are a disproportionate number of men in prison as opposed to women. Try and find out why and how that comes to be. Greater interest for me is how it is that different socioeconomic groups interact with the justice system. So I may look at the fact that there's a disproportionate, by far a disproportionate number of men from lower socioeconomic groups in prison. I work my way back from that as well. So basically, my work looks at the intersections of poverty and inequality with crime.
Now, I want to zero in on some of your work as you're well published. And one of your publications you conducted a few years ago in 2017, titled Perceptions of Familial Responsibility as a Practical Constraint in Judicial Decision Making, Focal Concerns and Gender Bias in Sentencing on the Island of Barbados. Tell me about the major findings coming out of that body of work.
Okay, so I should say first that one of my areas of focus within crime is different aspects of gender and crime. That was a gap in criminological research that I had identified when I began my career, and so one of my streams of research has been that. So that project was the culmination of a number of years work on gender and crime in Barbados. I was looking at, again, I spoke earlier a few minutes ago about looking at the number of men that are present in prison and working my way back. As we know, there is a disproportionate number of men in prison. There isn't a lot of research done on women and their interaction with the justice system in the Caribbean. There is barely any, and that's really a function of the numbers. By and large, those who come into contact with the criminal justice system are men. So the question is why that is, and what happens when women do come into contact with the justice system as opposed to men. So to be short, I was looking at how perceptions among those that make the decisions within the judiciary may affect that end product. And I found that, so there is an assumption that across the world really, but within the Caribbean as well, that the judiciary is lenient towards women, and that plays a great role in why it is that there's a disproportionate number of men in prison. My findings found that quite apart from women being, the judiciary being lenient towards women for their own benefit, that the thinking was that children needed to be protected. So children are the focus. That is the perception, that if we send women to prison, what will happen to the children? And I want to make that distinction is really, really important, because there is a big difference between chivalry, which is an old theory in criminology that speaks to the protection of women, and there's a big difference between that and the protection of children. because the protection of children and decisions made in order to do that requires a number of assumptions. It assumes that men do not take care of children, and it assumes that part of women's role, quite honestly, is to take care of children. So it goes beyond thinking that if we lock women away, there will be no one to take care of children. It is really women should be home taking care of children. The point I'm making is that it is a view that is rooted in patriarchy, and the interesting finding is that it's one of the few ways in which patriarchy benefits men in a million different ways. It is one of the ways in which patriarchy works to the detriment of men, because the assumption is that women should be home taking care of children and that men are not. Of course, we know that there are a lot of fathers who are absent. I want to make the point that there is a difference between non-residence and absenteeism. The Caribbean has a history of non-resident fathers, many of whom are very present in their children's lives.
They just don't live in home.
Just don't live at home. But the assumption, there is definitely an assumption, my findings found that there was definitely an assumption among magistrates that the majority of men that come into contact with the justice system wouldn't be taking care of children anyway, so we might as well lock them up. So
the major finding of your study was that our justice system does have a gender bias.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the major finding of my study was that there are gendered perceptions among the decision makers as it relates to magistrates, so many times unbeknownst to them, that affects their decision making.
Okay, so in 2016, you published a study on crime and violence in Barbados. The current situation, I'm sure, looks quite different to 6 years ago, but what were some of the major findings in that particular study?
Well, the trends are the same. Interestingly, Barbados has shown a fairly consistent pattern of crime over the years. A few years ago, and even now, there's definitely concern that we're seeing a spike in violent crime here. The truth is that Barbados has always had spikes in violent crime. There have been spikes, and then there have been dips. It's very interesting if you see the graph. Every 4 or 5 years, there's a spike, and then there's a dip. So I guess the point I'm making is that because we may be seeing a spike now, it doesn't necessarily mean that is going to spiral out of control. It may be part and parcel of the pattern that has been seen for a long time. But Barbados still, property crime dominates, particularly house breakings. That's an interesting finding within the context of the Caribbean. It's where you want to be. You don't want to have violent crime outstripping property crime. Barbados is actually one of the few, relatively few countries in the Caribbean where that is still the case. So, back in the 60s and 70s, that was the case for the majority of the islands. If you take countries like Jamaica, for example, somewhere during the late 60s, early 70s, violent crime started to grow, and they started to outstrip property crimes. And that is the case, has been the case since then, still is the case. Barbados is lucky enough that they haven't reached that point yet. Property crime still dominate. As I said, that is where you want to be as a country.
Now, while we don't yet have the most recent crime statistics for the first 6 months of 2022, the island's top cop, the Commissioner of Police, has indicated that there's a direct correlation between the high cost of living and the recent spike in crime that we are seeing. And I know that you have studied, researched crime and the association with poverty. Let's look at that.
Okay, so that, interesting enough, that is not an easy question to answer. It sounds logical.
Straightforward.
But it is, and it is logical. Of course, we know that there has to be some kind of association between poverty and crime. but it is not an easy thing to measure, or I should say it has proven itself to be a very difficult thing to measure globally. And the primary reason for that is what I would call a limited definition as it relates to poverty. Traditional measures of poverty focus on financial deprivation. So we're talking about either absolute or relative poverty. More often than not, there are efforts to determine a poverty line. Maybe that's a basket of goods and services. A figure is worked out that is commensurate with that. And if you fall below that line, you're poor. If you're above that line, you're not. That is basically what I'm referring to as a limited definition of poverty. More progressive definitions of poverty, and specifically social exclusion, are more all-encompassing concepts as it relates to deprivation, because they take into consideration a range of deprivations that may lead you to fall short of an acceptable standard of living. So it may be financial deprivation as part. It may be social exclusion suggests that all of these deprivations leave you shut out. So it may be a lack of opportunities within the job market. It may be a lack of access to education. And I want to make the point that when I say that, I don't mean, because people will say, but children of the poor, they go to school. What are you talking about? It is a lack of opportunity to take part in that aspect of the education system that matters. That is most associated with success. So I'll use the example of Jamaica. Most of our countries in the island, in the Caribbean, we have assimilated into an education system that was handed to us in the immediate aftermath of emancipation, and it wasn't set up with our interests in mind. It was set up for the benefit of the ruling class. So whereas, as I say, I'm using the example of Jamaica, there's a selective system of examinations at primary level, where it is that children are able to choose, write down the choices for where it is that they would like to go to school, and then those schools are able to, what I call cream, they're able to choose from the students who took the examination who it is that can come to their school. So it's a system of creaming, but it is a system that recycles poverty, because naturally, children of the poor who go to poorly equipped, poorly staffed primary schools are likely, not always, but they are set up to get worse grades than children of parents with means who go to better equipped, better staffed prep or primary schools. And they are the ones that populate the top performing high schools. What happens after that is that children of the poor are then funneled into, again, poorly staffed, poorly equipped high schools. And so that cycle of poverty regenerates. And that is one aspect of exclusion that is really important. My point is that it's not only one thing. It's not only financial deprivation. Mm-hmm. It's a multitude of forms of deprivation that all come together to leave people excluded. The important implication for this for crime prevention is that if we can determine and, for want of a better word, some kind of an index of exclusion, if we can work that out, that has enormous implications for reducing crime, because we can identify those individuals and communities that are most at risk of becoming involved in crime, and we can implement programs to primary level programs to stop the problem before it starts. But that includes identifying before it becomes a problem.
Professor Bailey, I want to follow on from something you just said, because it sounds as though that we are creating a situation of frustration from school that is now following some of the perpetrators into their adult life.
Well, I mean, the childhood years, adolescent and childhood years are critical years, and if we're speaking specifically to the education system, it is still, I mean, no matter what, and particularly in the Caribbean, education is still the best means of upward mobility. If it is that children are not given an opportunity to the best opportunity for success at that time, they start from a base of inequity. They are not starting life at the same level as those who have had a better opportunity. That is not something that is unique to any one island in the region. As I said, we have borrowed a system that, in totality, now I'm not speaking for every island, but in general, we are former colonies, and we have borrowed a system that was handed to us, and the purpose of that system was not for the benefit of everyone, and so it is operating in that way. It will always operate in that way unless the system is dismantled.
And that's where the social inequality starts.
Yes.
However, many would say, obviously, poverty is no excuse for crime.
Right. It's not about excuses. It's not about excuses. It is about reasons. And bear in mind, as I said, this depends on how it is that you define poverty. I'm saying it is not just financial deprivation. It is a range of deprivations. But it is not about excuses. It is about identifying the factors that cultivate criminal activity. There is no hiding from that. I don't want to make excuses for them, and they don't want excuses to be made for them. The fact of the matter is that there are sectors of the populations across the region that are negatively affected by structural inequalities that exist. And many of these structural inequalities have existed from the pre-emancipation period, post-emancipation period.
No, you are a major advocate for alternative forms of justice. Let's look at the whole concept of restorative justice, and what is it?
Okay, so let me backtrack a bit from that, or work my way forward to your question. All of us in the region, and when I say all of us, I mean all of us studying crime. We're interested in crime prevention. We all, policymakers, citizens, should be interested in crime prevention. Some of us, even without knowing it, are working in crime prevention. Those who are working in poverty alleviation are working in crime prevention. We come at it from different perspectives. What I explained to you a little while ago is my own perspective. But there is a temptation within the region when there are spikes in crime, particularly violent crime, to err on the side of crime control rather than crime prevention. So we're speaking of, for example, harsh measures designed to subdue. If you use the example of Jamaica, again, I don't mean to pick on my country, but it's a country ripe with research for crime for obvious reasons. But if you use the example of Jamaica from the late 60s onwards, there have been a number of operations enacted by the police. And if you just look at the names of those operations, Glock, Ardent, Acid, the names give you an idea of the purpose. Harsh measures designed to subdue. We'll hear things like zero tolerance. And I understand that temptation. There's regional panic when it is that, and national and regional panic when it is that crime, particularly violent crime, spikes. However, we have to understand that what we do after apprehension is just as important as the crime prevention measures that we put in place before. So what I'm saying is that it is what we do with offenders when they are captured, from the time of capture through to possible incarceration, has implications for levels of crime. And I think sometimes we forget that. So in comes restorative justice, which is an advocate of that type of thinking, and is in direct contrast to the kinds of retributive justice that we are used to in the region. So to answer your question, what restorative justice is a justice philosophy that seeks to bring together someone or people who have harmed with someone who has been harmed, and try collectively to achieve restitution within that context. Basically, the idea is to find alternatives to incarceration.
So in a nutshell, Professor Bailey, you're saying that restorative justice surrounds having a conversation, the victim and the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator.
Right.
What would that entail?
Right. So maybe first I should say that it's important that we use the language of restorative justice.
Sure.
Person who has harmed and person who has been harmed, rather than victim and perpetrator or victim and offender. It may sound irrelevant, but it really isn't. Okay, I think we need to. It's my belief that we need to redefine crime. So a lot of this requires changing in thinking, and I think we need to redefine crimes as breakdowns in relationships, and I mean or conflicts within the context of relationships, and I mean all crime, not just ones that we instinctively think of as conflict. All crimes as breakdown of relationships between a person who has harmed, a person who has been harmed, and the community. And that community could be a school, could be a family, could be a workplace, society, right? So if we can agree that on that redefining, then it should be easy for us to understand then that restitution must take place within that context and not within the environment necessarily of a prison. So we're talking about a voluntary meeting between those entities, between the person who has harmed and the person who has done the harm, so that both have play an active role in restitution. The person who has been harmed has an opportunity to confront the person who has harmed them, and the person who has done the harm has an opportunity to actively play a role in repairing that harm.
I'm sorry, I'm still trying to understand how this works.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm going to use the example from Jamaica. Again, I apologize for using Jamaica.
No,
a few days ago, there was a heinous crime. A young mother and her 4 children were slaughtered. That's the only term I can use to describe the story coming out of Jamaica. How do you then ask me to sit down with the person, as a relative of the young lady and her children,
Mm-hmm.
to sit down with the person who has harmed?
Right.
Where's the justice in that? I'm trying to understand.
So, good question, and I tread carefully, because what I instinctively want to say is, where is the justice in not involving the person who has been harmed? Because traditional forms of justice do not involve them. They lock people away, and the person who has been harmed is supposed to receive some kind of or feel some kind of benefit from that, and sometimes they do. I want to make a very, very important point and then come back and answer your question directly. This is something that we know works. Studies have shown that if we're speaking specifically to people who have been harmed, that in jurisdictions and countries that are utilizing restorative justice, the person who has been harmed feels more a part of the justice process and feels more satisfied with the result, having gone through restorative justice, than when somebody is locked away. Now, I'm a human, and I'm affected by stories like what you described, and so I totally understand the reluctance to accept that something like that could be solved in this way. Note that every society has the luxury of determining which crimes are diverted away from the traditional justice system, and also that someone who has gone through, or a crime that has gone through the restorative justice process could still end up with someone being incarcerated. It doesn't mean that the meeting has to result in someone not being incarcerated. It's just that we are trying to find alternatives to that. Third point, it's a voluntary process. It doesn't work if it's not voluntary. One of the risks of restorative justice is causing victims to relive their trauma. If it is sorry, I said victim. You see, I'm
Yeah.
I'm struggling to use the language as well. But you're not forced. If the person who has been harmed feels that it's not a process that they want to go through, and to be honest, if the person who has done the harm does not want to take part in the process, it doesn't happen. It has to be voluntary. So there is not the case that a country says, okay, we're jumping to restorative justice, so now everybody who has been harmed has to confront the person who has harmed them. It doesn't work that way. And a country may decide that there are certain crimes that are so heinous that they would prefer for them not to go through the restorative justice process. But there may come a time when it is that we accept that despite the awful nature of the crime, that they are best dealt with in that manner. Because I want to be clear that what we are doing is not working. Locking people up, whether it be whether you want it to be for the rest of their natural life, or if they are lucky enough, releasing them back into society with no opportunity for them to ever become productive members of society again, is not working. And as I said, it has implications for crime in the future. Studies also show that jurisdictions and countries that use restorative justice see reductions in crime. They also see reductions in recidivism, meaning that someone who has gone through the restorative justice process, who understands the harm that they have created and has played a role in restitution, is less likely to come into contact with the justice system again than someone who has been sent to prison and released.
No, you said that the current systems, in terms of punitive systems, are not working.
Right.
But a conversation is going to help. I'm just trying to be extremely clear, Professor.
It's more than a conversation. It operates within the confines of a meeting, but I want us to think of it more as restitution being achieved within the context of the stakeholders who have been affected by it. If it is that the person who has been harmed and the person who has done the harm are amenable to together working out a resolution to the offense that has occurred, the evidence shows that works much more so than locking somebody up. And I think that we are at a point where it is that I would like to think that we should be able to agree that evidence-based strategies as it relates to crime prevention are more useful than strategies proven not to work.
All right, still a lot more to discuss restorative justice, Professor. Stay with us. You're watching One on One.
Let me begin preparations. It's hurricane season. Let me sit down and reason. Let me secure a nation. Know your shelters, Bajan. Help out one another, his vibration. Develop emergency community plans so that we could function. Remove outdoor objects. Make sure that you went to the ATM. Stock up with water. Make sure you clean the guttering, Lord. What about canned food? Make sure you got some stock up in your room. Make sure you prop up the paling and tie down the roof. Let me start to prepare real soon. Let me begin preparations. It's hurricane season. Maybe sit down and reason. Maybe seek your nation. Know your shelters, Bajan. Help out one another, get vibration. Develop emergency community plans so that we could function.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ingrid Burrows, and I'm going to give you some tips on managing your hypertension. The first thing you should do is to decrease your salt intake. You should keep your salt intake to less than 1 gram a day. This is equivalent to about 1 teaspoon of salt every day. Another thing you should do is to ensure that you're getting enough physical activity. You should aim for 150 minutes of aerobic exercise every week of moderate intensity. For example, brisk walking, light jogging, swimming, or running. This equates to half an hour of exercise 5 days a week. You also want to increase your intake of fresh fruits and vegetables. It is advised that you eat 5 servings of fruit and vegetable every day. And the last thing you can do is monitor your blood pressure at home with a digital machine. This is very important as some patients have elevated blood pressures while in the doctor's office while having normal blood pressures at home. This is called white coat hypertension. Also, if you're taking medication for your hypertension and you notice any changes in your blood pressure, you can call your doctor and he or she can adjust your medications to suit. If your readings are too high or too low, you can inform your doctor and he or she can adjust your medications appropriately. I hope these tips have been helpful.
Let me begin preparations. It's hurricane season. Maybe sit down and reason. Maybe seek your nation. Know your shelters, Bajan. Help out one another, get vibration. Develop emergency community plans so that we could function. Remove outdoor objects. Make sure that you went to the ATM. Stock up with water. Make sure you clean the guttering, Lord. What about canned food? Make sure you got some stock up in your room. Make sure you prop up the paling and tie down the roof. Let me start to prepare real soon. Let me begin preparations. It's hurricane season. Let me sit down and reason. Let me seek your nation. Know your shelters, Bajan. Help out one another, get vibration. Develop emergency community plans so that we could function.
Everything comes at a cost. And these days, no one profits from the loss, like when a child is forced to trade school day socialization for screen time study, when a disease decides to disrupt our daily routine, and suddenly every one of us is coming undone, losing loved ones' lives and livelihoods, breath and breadwinners, families and festivals and freedoms. God, we feel like it's too much hassle to be human. We will always remember the years the earth spun quieter, but Mother Nature showed us how the simple act of standing still can wage war on an illness. So may we remember how to be our own army, how it takes cooperation for a community to build immunity, how unity can nurse us back to normalcy. Why stop at one family when we could save all?
Welcome back. Professor Bailey, we were discussing or trying to dissect the whole concept of restorative justice. Now, you said it mainly involves communication in terms of meeting those persons that have harmed and the persons that have been harmed. I'm trying to use your language, so bear with me. However, you're saying that you're trying to do this to avoid incarceration. Going back to the example I gave you about the mother and her 4 kids that were slaughtered, how do you justify having a conversation or, starting that kind of meeting with them, or the relatives rather, and then that person not going to prison?
Well, maybe they do end up in prison. What I'm saying is that, do you think it is unfair to say that prison should be a last resort for us within society? Look, I mentioned earlier that our education systems were handed down to us. It's the same with prison. Prison was, as we know it, developed in 19th century England. And it was developed for very specific purposes as it relates to three things: incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. Let's take deterrence. There is no evidence to suggest that prison deters. It may deter me and you. I have no intention of committing a crime, and I presume you to be the same. We are not in a position where that we deem that to be necessary. But there is the evidence that prison deters anyone who is at risk of criminal behavior is very weak to absent. Let's take rehabilitation. I would argue, as I said, this is a colonial institution that was handed down to us with the purposes handed down to us as well. I would argue that we maybe should stop asking the question that validates it, and that is, can we better rehabilitate people in prison, and start asking whether or not prison is the best place for that rehabilitation to take place in the first place. We have a history of locking people up and releasing them back into society with no opportunity to become productive members of society again, and so they end up right back where they were. Quite separate and apart from them not being better off, they aren't even released the same. They're released worse. So imagine locking someone up for something like theft, for example. They spend a while in prison and emerge a more hardened version of themselves, and end up right back in prison. Is that justice? Is that fair? Does that have any benefit to society? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves, because even if we can't, you see, we think of alternatives to incarceration as being easy on people who have come into contact with the law, and that's because we are trained. We've been brought up in a system of punitive justice, which is based on revenge. Surely we need to start thinking about what is better for society. And if it is that we can accept that what we're doing now is not working, surely we have to find alternatives to it.
But what type of punishment are we looking at when we talk about restorative justice?
Well, it depends. I think there's a belief that it ends at a conversation. That conversation has to come to a resolution. As I said, maybe that individual still goes to prison. Maybe it is that they do community service. Maybe it is that they go through some kind of psychological program
for a crime like murder.
Well, why is there this temptation to jump to the most heinous form? Restorative justice could be instituted here in Barbados, and they leave murder to go through the traditional justice system. The benefits of it, or our decision to use it, should not be based on the worst form of crime. I want to go back to what I said earlier. Property crime dominates in Barbados. Mm-hmm. Barbados hasn't reached a point where violent crimes dominate. Are we really going to keep doing something that is not working because of a fear that a crime that is not as dominant as lesser forms will not be sufficiently punished?
So, Professor Bailey, you're saying that we should not be incarcerating persons accused of theft?
I don't believe that that's a productive method of dealing with the crime. No, I certainly don't believe that should be the first resort. Someone steals and gets locked up in prison for a while. As I said, the nature of the institution means that they're going to be released back into society with no hope of being productive members again. But
we're not talking about somebody who's stolen a loaf of bread because they're hungry. You've broken into my house, stolen jewelry, my money, and you should get a slap on your wrist.
What do you think should happen to them?
No, you tell me.
I'm asking you. What
No,
do
you
think
tell me, because you're telling me that they shouldn't be incarcerated.
Why should they? Or I should say, as I said, why should that be our first option? If you get back, for example, if you get back what was stolen, why do you need a more punitive result than that? But let me go further. If it is that you can accept that that is not beneficial for society, why would you want that? If someone breaks into your house, steals your money, you're able to get that money back. That person is able to, you're able to find another way for in addition to getting back the money, for that person to repair the harm created. Why would you put them into an institution that we know is not beneficial to him or society, that we know will release him back into society, a more hardened version of himself, to commit a more heinous crime, all to satisfy a desire for revenge?
Do you think that there's been a difficulty in instituting restorative justice because we do believe that the punishment should fit the crime?
Worldwide?
Worldwide and in the Caribbean?
Of course. Well, I think that's a good question. There are many reasons why it hasn't been done in the Caribbean. Generally, countries like Jamaica has been making really good strides, and ironically, that is the country that you use the example from. So it means that there is a recognition that despite these terrible forms, that we still need to do something different. As I said, those types of crimes need not go through the restorative justice process if society determines that they shouldn't. But I think that the world and parts of the Caribbean are waking up to the fact that what is going on is not working. Everywhere that restorative justice has been introduced has been greeted with skepticism.
Of course.
But as I said, we're not talking about something that has not been proven to work. The statistics show that it does work. It reduces crime, it reduces recidivism, and people who have been harmed feel more satisfied with the result.
And you are advocating, obviously, for restorative justice because our current punitive system is not working.
Quite simply, because it is not working, and I don't believe that true justice is served. I don't believe it to be just and fair. And by I'm talking about, I'm not talking about specifically Barbados. I'm talking about the region and in most parts of the world. But as I said, there is a wind of change that I welcome. But yes, it is not working, and I think that is obvious to see. So alternatives need to be found.
Professor Bailey, from where you sit at this moment, do you think you will get buy-in for the concept of restorative justice?
Hard to answer. I would hope so. I think that it will require, as I say, it requires a change in thinking and a change in perspective and a realization that what we're doing isn't working. If crime is not showing any signs of slowing across the region, and we've been doing the same thing for years, I don't believe it to be a difficult sell that something different needs to be done. And I believe strongly that we need to stop thinking that the harsher the punishment, the better the result, because we know enough now to accept that that's not the case. I think the case is closed on that. And I want to make the point that I reiterate the point that we should not focus on the worst form of criminality. We don't have to start there. We can start from milder forms. Do we believe that someone who is hungry and has stolen something deserves to be locked up in prison? I don't believe that to be a difficult sell. Shouldn't we all want to find alternatives to this? I want to ask a question rhetorically, because I think the answer to it, or within the answer to that, lies much of the issue that many people have with alternative forms of justice. Who is to blame for criminal behavior? Does society play a role? Or is it all the fault of the individual? We tend to punish people in the Caribbean as if society has no role to play. As if it is that society has done nothing to create what it is that is happening. As if it is all the individual. So that's something that we need to think about, because restorative justice questions that.
In your research, have you found that perhaps the approach to restorative justice, or that it could encourage persons to take situations into their own hands? Because if you're instituting restorative justice, the system is not going to deal with the person who is harmed in the way that I would want them dealt with.
Well, first of all, it might. As I said, restorative justice does not mean that the person who goes through the process will automatically not end up in prison. But people take matters into their own hands now. So there is no.
But we could see an increase in that. That's what I'm saying.
You're asking me if I think so?
Yes.
No, I don't, because I don't think it necessarily. I don't think that there is anything at all that stops people who are prone to taking justice into their own hands from doing it now. It happens too often. It is extremely common. So I think the more pertinent question would be, what is it that we are doing now that encourages it?
But what are we doing now that encourages it? Besides, as you said, in terms of the education system and some children being,
Well, I think that we have a culture across the region of violence. we are culturally accepting of violence, and whether or not we know it, how it is that we deal with people who have created harm plays into that. We do not the feeling that if someone does something to us that they deserve the harshest punishment possible. If that is signaled to people by the state, all vigilante justice is doing is carrying out that mandate and saying, let me do it because the state may not catch him. But the belief is that the end product should be the same, that they should either die or be locked away forever. So what we should be asking ourselves is, how do we move away from that way of thinking?
And you're also against corporal punishment.
I am.
This is both in the school and at home.
I am, but I have a child, so so Lord knows he tests me. I think that's it's not something I touch research-wise. I'm not convinced that we're ready for that. But I personally am against it. And I'm 100% against it within the school context.
Okay. And in terms of starting the whole restorative justice process, I know we were speaking off camera about looking at alternatives perhaps to suspension and expulsion from schools.
Right. So I think it's easy to get bogged down, as I said, with number one, with crimes, and number two, with the worst form of crime. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to make decisions based on that. As I said earlier, offenses take place within a variety of contexts. One of those is the school. So we may be talking about trying to find ways to avoid what is the ultimate punishment within the school context, and that is expulsions and suspensions. I'd like to think that most parents out there think that they would not want their child to get suspended, so I feel, or expelled. So I feel that it is a useful entry point to get people to start thinking about the benefits to finding alternatives to ultimate punishments.
And so you think that we just have a culture of more or less discarding people before giving them a chance?
I think that we have across the region have a culture of harsh punishments. We believe that the harsher the punishment, the better the effect, and we're doing something that is empirically proven to not be the case. Corporal punishment doesn't work, and suspending and expelling children does not work. It doesn't have if the effect is to correct behavior, then it does not work.
Professor Bailey, what type of society should we want for ourselves if we move towards restorative justice versus a punitive system?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think that it requires a rethink, and it requires everyone to be involved in that rethink. But I think at the base of it, we have to ask ourselves what type of society we want to be a part of. So if I was to ask you, for example, what type of society do you envision for yourself and your children in the next 50 years? What do you dream of? Surely we shouldn't, in a best case scenario, which we should allow ourselves to dream of best case scenarios. Surely we shouldn't be saying that as it relates to punishment, we want what? Bigger and better prisons? We want more people locked up in prisons? Surely we should be able to allow ourselves to dream of a time when there are less people in prison, and maybe even one day no need for them.
You really see that happening?
Not necessarily, but we can dream, and we can move towards it, and the closer we get towards it, the better it is for society.
Professor Bailey, thank you so much for trying to break down the whole concept of restorative justice, and we will see if Barbados indeed adopts this approach.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. That was Professor of Sociology, Crime and Social Inequality at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, Professor Corin Bailey. I'm Lisa Lord. This was One on One. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a wonderful evening.